Our next speaker is Juan Parra Cancino from the Orpheus Institute, and he will talk about towards performance practice in computer music on interpretation. Please, Juan.
Yes. Well, my name is Juan Parra Cancino, and I'm part of the research project Music Experiment 21 that gave the performance last night. And what I want to share with you today is a quick overview of how basically the somewhat aesthetic specific role of a computer music practitioner ended up working in a research project that deals with canonic repertoire of, let's say, 19th century piano music. First, I want to give you a short overview of where my background is. I am a composer, I'm a computer music performer, and for many years I have been working in exploring ways to represent and present the potential of computer as a traditional musical instrument, both from the compositional and the performer viewpoints. So that led to a PhD project that was finished at Leiden University in 2014, that is available online, where I started by the premise, let's say, what is now broadly presented for PhD students as the research question, was this idea of starting from an assumption of the roles of composer, luthier, and performer being somehow an indivisible entity when it comes to computer music practice. I propose a strategy to consider, treat, and explore these three roles as completely isolated and independent within the field of electronic music. And in order to do that, I created a number of, let's say, research modules or research strategies or groups or ensembles where I will present these three roles or my involvement in those as isolated as possible from the other two decision-making or artistic or technical tasks. The first example that I'm going to show you now is quite dated, but it's as good as a prehistoric in the olden days, as the comedian said before, back in the early or mid 2000s. So this is a project that I had for 7 years, where we acted as a traditional percussion trio, but two of the three percussionists happened to be computer performers. And the idea behind that behind that project was to commission composers and force them to write the computer parts, to notate them for someone else to play, which is a step that is still quite underdeveloped when it comes to the interaction between electronic performers and composers. So this is I don't know how clear or unclear it is, but you can see that still this is a piece by a Mexican composer called Rodrigo Sigal, who studied at City University many years ago. And he still, basically, he took at heart the idea of the computer performer. So he designed instruments, interfaces that use the laptop traditional interface, so the keyboard and the mouse, as the way to triggering and filtering sounds. And the center line of the score, you can see, is more traditionally musically written and is aimed to the percussionists on the trio. So here goes a very short excerpt, if it works. It doesn't. Yes, it does. Let's see now. The odd choice for the instrument also came from the fact that at the beginning we didn't give any limitation to the composers, and we got quite a few pieces for 5-octave marimbas and things like that. So we ended up asking for instruments that could be found anywhere in the world or that could be purchased in any hardware store. So that's the reason of the Linux toolbox. So this kind of works, I mean, these kind of projects and other more traditional in the sense of doing, let's say, programming for composers or doing the designing live electronic systems for other performers to play, led to the sad realization or the acceptance that my initial strategy to divide these roles, it was basically impossible. That if there was anything clear at the beginning of the research, was that these three roles are indivisible, and that if anything, you should take that into your advantage and consider, treat, and explore this multi-threaded role as the definition of what could be considered musicianship in computer music practice. So that all these three roles are interdependent, and you can combine them. So I started with a new artistic research strategy, and that led to the starting of my PhD, where I presented an interdependent approach for composition, performance, and instrument design that will act and inform each other. And just to give a quick example, the premises were, for example, to define a musical quality that was particular or unique to electronic music, and then explore the historical context or the evolution of that quality in existing repertoire, and treat it as a traditional musical parameter. So this is something that can be exposed and presented and modified in a live concert situation. And in the end, to create an interface, an instrument, a way to explore these qualities in performance. And finally, once that project was done, to explore the potential of this instrument or this object in different musical settings. So there was was it Atao yesterday, who was what is the I in NIME? So what is the end of this, creating these kind of hybrid interfaces that are for one performance only, or for one performer only, or what, in my case, what is the potential of going through this process and then rendering itself to different musical situations. And so just to go through this exercise, we're going to replace this. So defining a musical quality could be the idea or the notion of the manipulation of the physical space over time as something that, although is present and existent in traditional instrumental music, is something that is much more explored and available in electronic media. And then explore that, let's say, they do the kind of musicological and historical analysis of how this has been used in the works of, for example, Yannick Xenakis, Nono, or Stockhausen. And then treat this as a musical parameter is, for example, go through the process of mapping and parameterization of something that could be called a dynamic space, so height, distance, density, position, trajectories, or things that are more poetic, like time displacement, memory, waves, things like that, that will also trigger, let's say, more poetic musical decision-making in a concert situation. Then the idea of the creation of an instrument, for those who were yesterday in the performance, is my eternal prototype, the Phoenix egg. So there's a little close-up there. It used to have a little sibling that generated the sounds, but that died a long time ago. And then to explore the instrument potential in different musical settings where I have used it in live improvisation settings, but I also used it yesterday in a much more, for me, musical traditional context. So I'm gonna do a little quick leap, and because I don't have a lot of time left, but I just want to point you to 6 minutes? Oh, okay. I'm still gonna point you to three websites. They're all research catalog entries. I think that the more robust is this one, which contains the whole of my PhD dissertation. Is available both in the website of the Leiden University, but it's open access, and I just want to show just to give what was promised in the paper, just to give you a little overview of this idea of the focusing on going from this creation of an instrument and the informed way that this instrument relates to pre-existing repertoire and a larger musical tradition, and how I made the leap towards the proactive, no longer commission of new works, but the connection towards pre-existing repertoire. So if you go here into the idea of interpretation paths, you can see that there are three subcategories, which I call reconstruction, reinterpretation, and reappropriation. These three categories are a little bit arbitrary, as any, let's say, practice-led research or composers making and performers making research about their own work will end up being. But the idea was to go back to the initial premise of seeing how this notion of the composer, the performer, and the instrument builder or the luthier will inform this practice. So when it comes to the idea of interpretation or idea of working with pre-existing repertoire, I also found case studies where, although these three components or the three activities were existent and were present in my approach towards these works, one of them was clearly the salient. So in the case of the idea of reconstruction, that came from a primarily technical assignment that was to create a digital electronic setup of both the compositions A Pierre and Postpreludium Perdonau by Luigi Nono, and that was for the intention of a larger musicological research to be able to practice the piece, rehearse it without the financial and space constraints of hiring the original setup. But as it happens, with these digitized toolboxes, the best suited performer for them ended up being me. So I ended up involved in a more artistic capacity in that project. The second, the notion of reinterpretation, that was, let's say, trying to analyze more the performance tradition of this work by John Cage, Aria, and Fontana Mix, and how, although they were originally conceived as a joint piece, they gained separate lives over time. So in this section of the thesis, you can see how I go through the relationship between David Tudor and John Cage, the relationship of David Tudor doing his own electronic music after John Cage, and how his understanding of what interpretation is informed my own reconstruction or reinterpretation of an electronic system that generates versions of Fontana Mix or versions of electronic soundtracks to that are following the same rules than Fontana Mix to accompany a live performance of Aria by a live singer. And the third task, the idea of reappropriation, that is more, let's say, using the compositional hat, the composer's hat, and see how much you can extract compositional ideas from technical setups of composers and from, let's say, compositional problems of composers in traditional or instrumental music, and how can those problems be translated into dimensions that are unique to the electronic domain. This particular case study, if I would have had time, I would have loved to play it for you because it's very simple to set up, but the idea behind it is to translate The King of Denmark by Morten Feldman, where, let's say, the main performative issue and the sonic consequence from it is derived from the idea of playing or executing sounds that are extremely soft. So for the audience members and even for the performer, not all of them come up, or they are not all manifested. And my idea was to translate this dynamic domain of traditional or acoustic music into the time domain. So I created a dynamic stochastic mapping for a controller, a pad controller, that will change in terms of the directionality. So onsets will be sounding, or offsets will be sounding, or there will be time delays between pressing a number of buttons and what sounds will come up and when they will come up. So I think that's the time that I have for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan, for your presentation and for the time. And we have time for 2 or 3 questions. If there's anyone in the room. We have one back there.
Thank you, Juan, for your talk, and nice to see the egg last night. So you talk about the blending of the roles of composer and performer, luthier, but then you study composers, Nono, Cage, Feldman. Why not, for example, David Tudor?
I did. I'm sorry, I went very quickly through it. When I approached the Cage, I focused on John LaBarbera and David Tudor and the relationship to that particular piece.
Or are there other examples of this sort of blended?
Yeah, for Fabriciani and Carlos Sciaffino and let's say all the collaborators of Nono. So I did, and this is, let's say, these were the particular case studies. Later on, and if I had time, I would have shown you that one of my most recent projects that happened within the framework of the Music Experiment 21 research project was the reconstruction of Hyperion by Bruno Maderna, where basically the main role of Maderna in the materials that I used was his role as a conductor of that piece, not as a composer. And most primarily also one of the sources of inspiration for the choices that I made for the electronic part was the version of Carmelo Bene of that particular work. Carmelo Bene is an actor that did his own interpretation of that piece. So I am very interested in how musicians deal with the material as well.
More questions? We have time for another one. Well, I think that we have to thank you again, Juan, for your wonderful paper.
I'll do a new piece.
Yeah?